I think William brings a tremendous amount of talent and ability to this radio program, and I'm very happy and excited to have him with us, and I'm sure you will be too. And I would like to thank all of you for your wonderful prayers and support for my wife, Anne, who, as you know, is recovering in the hospital from a very serious brain hemorrhage. She is, however, recovering well and expected to be fully recovered in about a month. Until that time, however, William will be continuing to do all of the Dreamlands because obviously I like to read the books very carefully and thoroughly, as does William, and I cannot do that at the present time. So welcome William Henry to Dreamland, and this is a great show, by the way, and later on, do not miss Linda Moulton Howe talking about General Wesley Clark. It is extraordinary. Thank you very much. UFOs, aliens, ghosts, psychic phenomena, lost civilizations, abductions, you name it, we talk about it because this is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland, where we go farther out on the edge than any other radio program out there. You will hear things here that you have never heard before, and you will never hear anywhere else. So fasten your seatbelts and get ready to fly. I'm going to take you for a ride to Dreamland.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. My guest today is John Gordon. John's a senior fellow of the Theosophical Society of England, where he lectures on ancient history and metaphysics. He is the author of several books, and today we're going to be talking about him with his most recent book, Egypt, Child of Atlantis, in which he reveals that Egyptian civilization is far older than commonly believed and that its sacred science was the legacy of star beings who founded Atlantis. John, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk to you.
Very, very nice. John, Egypt, Child of Atlantis. Now, you know Egyptologists love that title. Why the title, John?
The title was actually chosen by my publishers, not by me. I was rather concerned that when I saw it, that it would have exactly the sort of effect that you are talking about. It's a serious book, and unfortunately, a lot of scholars tend to think that the word Atlantis anywhere in the title of a book takes it straight off the wall. That obviously isn't the case, as you will have seen from the amount of references there are in the book to support what I said.
Right, and I can assure you the Dreamland audience, John, takes the title very seriously. Many of us have researched the concept of Atlantis and its connection to ancient Egypt. Having said that, I wanted to share with the audience something that you had written in your chapter called Reflections, which I think really encapsulates this whole notion of where we're at in terms of the Egypt-Atlantis connection. You say that on the one hand, there are Islamic fanatics, who would dearly and misguidedly like to reduce every vestige of Egyptian art and architecture to rubble as the idolatrous products of heretics. On the other hand, what do we have, John?
Well, I mean, the extremists that one finds in any religion are always in a minority, but they are always the most vocal minority, and they try to make out that they are the biggest noise around. The vast proportion of Muslims are, in fact, very peaceful types, and really, when you get down to talk to them about it, there's not a great deal of difference between what they believe and what the ancient wisdom tradition is actually saying. The thing is, the way in which Islam, and the same in Christianity and Judaism, the way things have been put by scholars and theologians over the last 2,000 years, or 1,400 years in the case of Islam, has distorted the ancient traditions right out of all proportion. But when you actually put it to them in a way that they can understand in their own context, they can see the correlations between them. So there's not a huge difference between what I'm saying and what other people are saying like me, and what thinking people within the normal religions themselves believe.
And what do you think is that invisible bridge? What can take us to a full and more complete understanding of our origins? And can you talk for a moment also about what you feel those origins actually, how did the origins of humanity take place in this context?
It's a very, very big question. The idea of star gods comes from the idea that mankind is divine in its real nature. But without understanding the nature of spirit and soul in the way that the ancients actually understood it, the whole thing falls to the ground. If I try to explain to a scientist today, for example, that the ancient way of expressing the word spirit is directly, in fact, is exactly the same as the way the scientist uses the word energy, except for the fact that the scientist uses the word in a quantitative sense, whereas the ancients used it in a qualitative sense. Provided there is that understanding, then the whole thing starts to come to life. The great problem today is that scientific orthodoxy takes the view that there is such a thing as dead matter, which underpins the whole of materialistic philosophy or science, because science at the moment doesn't have a great deal of philosophy. But the ancients took the view that there was no such thing as dead or inert matter, that the whole universe was a unity of existence with a consciousness and a creative intelligence attached to it. Now, that's quite a long way from the way modern science actually looks at it. And when you start to look at it closely, you can also see how theology, religious theology, has actually twisted away from the central idea so as to make it a very much more personalized thing. And by doing that, they've lost the plot as to the way in which the ancients actually saw things objectively. I don't know if that helps.
And that, to me, is one of the most important aspects of the book that you brought such clarity to, because we've just had an election here in America, and you listen to American talk radio, and we have evangelical Christians claim that the re-election of George W. Bush is a victory for their conservative brand of Christianity, yet we know for a fact that modern Christianity is the Egyptian religion retooled with different names. So how far away are we as a culture when a self-proclaimed majority bases its politics and especially its military policy on a widespread misinterpretation or denial of the facts?
Well, if you look back through history, the same thing has happened again and again. People win wars as a result of, it's a very ancient idea that the first casualty in war is truth. It's exactly the same where politics is concerned. And where one is trying to get across the ideas and concepts found in the ancient wisdom tradition, there are two problems, immediate problems one comes across. First of all, there is inertia. A lot of people don't actually want to know about these things, because the moment you do start to understand the ancient wisdom tradition, or the tradition itself, you have to start taking responsibility for your own life. It's much easier to belong to a religion and to sort of palm your responsibility off onto somebody else, whether it be a priest or an idea of God or whatever. And politics tends to suffer from the same sort of basic idea. People like to hand over their responsibilities to politicians, the sort of modern idea of priests, just in the same way that scientists seem to take over the idea of priests themselves. So, there's a fundamental hurdle that one has to get over before you can get people to actually start thinking. So it's vitally important to try and get them to understand that the ancient wisdom tradition does not actually conflict with what they're saying. It's just that what they have been told doesn't actually tell the whole of the truth.
Okay, so let's say I'm a person that's willing to cross over the hurdle. I'm on the path. I'm open. What's one of the first things you're going to tell me beyond that I must take self-responsibility for my own, I guess my spiritual salvation is what you're saying. What's the first thing you're going to tell me about ancient Egypt and its great monuments? Were they tombs? And how far back does the history of Egypt go, actually?
Well, the history of Egypt, according to a variety of traditions, goes back hundreds of thousands of years to a time when modern anthropology seems to believe that we were still running around in skins and hadn't even thought of the idea of civilized life. Now, once you start looking at Darwinian theory, you start to see a lot of holes in it. Anthropology has followed the Darwinian theory right the way down the line. It has produced an awful lot of assumptions about the way humanity came into existence, and that, together with some of the assumptions made in relation to biblical tradition, has actually conditioned the whole of historical thought, scholars' thought about history, and the suggestion that's come out of it that Egypt is only 5,000 years old. Now, the Egyptians themselves were of the opinion that it went back certainly well over 50,000 years, and there are other traditions that one finds amongst the Greeks and elsewhere that the ancient wisdom was to be found going back amongst the Hindus, the Assyrians, and the Chaldeans well over 200,000 years. So, that being the case, one has to approach the whole subject of anthropology very carefully in order to set the scene before trying to get across the ideas of the ancient wisdom tradition. You know, it's very easy to start halfway up the pole, but I try to approach it from the point of view of looking at the background logic first of all.
And one of the other things that I really liked that you did in Egypt, Child of Atlantis, was to really paint a picture of our sun and solar system as being in a kind of a safe haven in our Milky Way galaxy, and that the Egyptians seem to have had a very profound knowledge of that. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yes, indeed. Well, it wasn't, of course, just the Egyptians. The Egyptians had it, in a way that was peculiar to themselves, but one finds all over the world the idea that mankind, divine mankind, had its origin as a spirit within the Pleiades. And the Pleiades, of course, are part of the constellation of Taurus, and this appears to be why we find that there are so many religions all around the world, and philosophies and belief systems, which have the bull as the center of that belief system, the bull in a metaphorical sense. In other words, the idea that, as we find in the Egyptian system, that the divine spark in man, once he has achieved through his spiritual redevelopment, he then re-becomes what was called by the Egyptians the bull of his mother. Now, modern scholars and scientists have completely failed to understand the background, the logical and sequential background of what the Egyptians and others were talking about. And consequently, they think that this idea of man having come from the stars and going back to the stars, as we find in the Egyptian tradition, is just based on superstition. And in fact, there's nothing in the way of superstition involved in it. You take away the idea, the materialistic idea that modern science is actually based upon, and the whole thing starts to come to life. So you can see that there is a sequence, a very, very strong sequence, between the way the whole system actually operates from the celestial right down to the planetary. That is fundamentally important to understanding what ancient Egyptian religion and philosophy was all about.
And the original Maya, it's been said or claimed, were intergalactic star beings or entities who left behind, according to some prophecies, specifically for our time, and particularly for 2012, in the culmination of a 26,000-year cosmic cycle. Now, you talk a lot about that in your book. What do you have a relationship between the ancient Egyptian teachings concerning the precession of the equinox, this 26,000-year cycle, and what is occurring or unfolding in our present time?
Yes. One of the points that I actually made about the precession of the equinox is that it is actually based upon an illusion. It happens, but it doesn't happen for the reason that modern science suggests. In other words, that it's due to a wobble in the Earth's cycle. That, in fact, it is rather more due to the fact that our solar system itself revolves around a parent star. And it's in the course of that revolution that we appear to be wandering backwards through the cycle that's called the precession of the equinoxes. Now, I take the view very strongly that the idea of gods, as it were, having descended to Earth as gods, as it were, in spaceships, does not hold true. The ancient wisdom tradition, what it was saying was that it is the divinity in man that descended to Earth and took a human form. And it's as a result of the development, the evolutionary spiritual development through the mystery tradition that one finds in Egypt, in Greece, amongst the Mayas and elsewhere, that the individuality within, the divine spark within, was supposed to be able to regain its celestial state, its divine state. So one has to be, I think, very, very careful indeed about the way in which one interprets what the ancients were trying to say. One shouldn't try and materialize it too much.
Right, and that's been the tendency in a materialistic culture. We invent airplanes, and now we see flying craft. But flying craft have appeared in artwork throughout the ages. Let's talk about...
Well, that is true, but one has to take into consideration the fact that the ancients talked in metaphor and allegory. So despite the fact that they may have described a craft of some sort or described the human soul as a bird with a human head, all of these things are indicative of metaphor and allegory, and one has to look at it from that basis. Otherwise, one completely fails to understand what it's all about.
Right, and so when the Egyptians describe our cosmic predicament as a soul, in a nutshell, then, how would you encapsulate that for us?
Well, it's obviously a very long story. When you're talking to people today, they don't really understand. Even churchmen, theologians, they do not understand what you mean by the word spirit or soul. Mm-hmm. What I've tried to explain is that the soul itself is, in fact, a group of spirits with a sense of its own self or individuality. This comes back to the whole question of the universe being a unity of existence, but with a sort of a breakdown internally into groups of entities and sub-entities. So when you understand that there is a soul and that the soul itself is the repository of consciousness in any one state, it begins to become more obvious why it is that the Egyptians said that man had three souls: a planetary soul, which they called the Ba, a spiritual soul related to the solar system, which they called the Sa, and a cosmic or divine soul, which they called the Sekhem. And the whole point was that the divine spark in man had to progress through these soul states and actually escape from them, because that each of them had a level of consciousness which not only provided wisdom, but it also provided a limitation of existence. So there's a paradox involved in it as well.
So the idea
trying to get this across to people is actually very difficult.
Right. And so ultimately what we have, though, is an opportunity to, in fact, become the gods that the ancient Egyptians talked about.
That's correct.
And then in becoming them, we actually transcend them and return into a higher form.
That's correct. What is not implicit in the Egyptian system or any other system is that the ancients took the view that everything in the cosmos was actually part of the mind of a deity or an intelligence beyond all comprehension, and they therefore didn't actually try to name it. But what they did actually say was that there was a distinction within this mind of God, as it were, just as there is a distinction in the mind of man between the memory on the one hand and imagination on the other. And therefore that man, or rather the angels, the devas, are representative of the memory of God, as it were, and therefore have no sense of choice. But man is representative of the divine, the creative intelligence and imagination, and therefore he does have choice. And consequently, it's because of the interaction of the two that we have what the Bible refers to as the war in heaven. Exactly as what the same thing that happens that takes place in our own mind.
Mm-hmm. And so, on that note, what then was the ultimate purpose of the Egyptian temples? Why were they built, and how were they used?
Well, if you have a look in the book itself, you will see that provided a number of diagrams, including diagrams of the Nile.
They're outstanding diagrams, too.
Good. Well, thank you. What they do actually show is that there are very strong correlations with some of the celestial bodies. For example, Robert Bauval has shown quite distinctively that the three pyramids at Giza are representative of the three stars of Orion's belt. But if you have a look at the temples at the northern end of the Nile, at the southern end of the Nile, between Philae and coming down to Abydos, you see that the Nile itself follows the exact shape of Ursa Minor. And it is also quite clear that the ancient Egyptians actually moved the Nile 1 mile from its original course in order for it to actually take that shape. And then all the temples then, from Philae coming down towards Abydos, are spaced exactly at the same positions as we find as the 7 stars in the constellation of Ursa Minor. So they had a very, very strong sense of the idea that heaven had to be brought down to earth.
And what were they doing that for, John? Why did they need to bring heaven down to earth?
Because they believed that there was a unity of existence in the cosmos. They believed in the fundamental nature of what we call sympathetic magic. But as far as they were concerned, it was a sympathetic association between all things. Therefore, the mysteries were concerned with trying to explain to those who wanted to see exactly what those sequential associations were. And in order to ensure that the way in which humanity functioned on this planet functioned in concord with the way the universe was supposed to function, the Egyptians took the view that everything had to coincide with the way the cosmos above was actually set out. That's why we find the pyramids, the temples actually set out in the positions that they were, although a lot of them no longer exist, unfortunately.
Right, and you go to Egypt and you walk those temples, and you definitely get the sense that you're in some form of a tomb. And I know that's, and I use that in the sense of as if I were underneath the Great Lakes of the United States, underwater, and I'm looking at a shipwreck. I mean, you definitely feel like it's lost much of its glory. And the question is, will that glory return? Or do you think that Egypt is going to stay just the way it is and we're going to fight a battle against deterioration?
Well, I think I wouldn't say the battle is lost, but one really needs to get to Egypt now rather than later, because there doesn't seem to be very much understanding of or will to try and preserve the nature of the temples and the pyramids. There's a certain amount of movement in that direction, but it's really only for the purposes of tourism, trying to reestablish it or trying to put it back together for the purposes of understanding in a spiritual sense. I think that is long gone. That particular horse has bolted. I don't think there's much of a chance there.
Right, and so many spiritual tourists go to Egypt today with the intention of reactivating those temples, and I think ultimately what they're trying to do is just really to reactivate themselves.
That's correct. I think that's absolutely right.
And could you describe for me, from your perspective, what does a fully activated human being look like or act like, or how would you identify such a person in our modern era?
Well, I think the short word is normal. What you would hope and expect a normal human being to be. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the majority of people allow their worst nature, the elemental nature within them, to take over, and they lose their normality. They lose their self-respect as a result. And the moment you lose your self-respect, you've lost your spiritual contact. That's why self-respect is so very, very important in terms of the whole way in which the spiritual path actually works. It's self-respect not in the sense of, dare I say it, loving yourself, the way the New Age puts it. One has to put oneself to one side and to understand that the universe consists of feeling, but not one's personal feelings. And there's a distinction between the two, which is fundamental, but which people don't often understand. They get the two mixed up. And the moment you start getting mixed up with personal emotions, rather than your sensory feelings, spiritual feelings, you've lost the plot altogether. So you have to be very careful.
If you could see a time-lapse movie of the Earth from, say, 1750 to 2004, in some people's perspective, you'd see a cancerous invasion. You'd see a species that devours its forests, pollutes its skies, pollutes the ocean, that's spreading out everywhere in greater and greater numbers and in greater and greater concentration until you reach a point where here we are today in an artificial world. Would you call that a new Atlantis? Is this a step forward or, in your estimation, a step backward?
I think humanity does tend to do this all the time. They say there's nothing new in history, and the further you look back, the more you come across situations and environments where people have done exactly the same thing in a slightly different way. There's always been a case of the people who are willing to take the spiritual responsibility for guiding their own destiny and trying to help others have always been in the minority. They've always been on the fringe. Humanity's tendency is to try and put everything in a materialistic way. But in the first place, when that is done, it is, in a sense, an expression of the sense of holiness. The great problem is when future generations come along, they don't bother to see the origin of the idea. They merely pick up the literal threads and say, well, we don't have to bother about anything else. We can believe this literally. And therefore, the sense of trying to see into things so that one has spiritual insight no longer applies. So the whole sense of cycles that I've mentioned in the book is fundamentally important to understanding the fact that these ups and downs take place all the time, and we have to accept that as part and parcel of existence.
And you also mentioned the idea that the entire population of the ancient world was attuned to the form of nature and cosmic evolution at all levels of being, from the highest to the most mundane. What was daily life like for an ancient Egyptian or even an Atlantean?
Well, again, it's one would find oneself, I think, speculating to try and understand that. If you go to a place like India at the moment, you will find places where the people have such a tremendously strong sense of their religion, the devotional side of their religion, that the whole of their life becomes a religious practice. And as Herodotus actually said about the Egyptians, Egypt didn't actually have a religion. Egypt was religion. So one finds at certain times within the greater cycles, the celestial cycles, that this situation does apply, that the majority of human beings in any one society at that time will be highly spiritual. But the cycle itself will then take humanity away from that, necessarily, because in exactly the same way that you have the sort of fertilization that takes place in nature, so you need the apples and the other things to form fruit, out of which the seeds of the future cycle can be born. So, although we look at things from one point as being highly materialistic, we have to recognize the fact that this is a normal part of the cycle, and we just have to go with the flow. It doesn't mean to say that we have to be totally conditioned by the materialism or overcome by it, but at the same time we have to recognize that it is part and parcel of the way nature works.
Mm-hmm. There's a fellow named David Wilcock who is citing Russian scientists who claim that they can show evidence that every planet in our solar system is showing signs of brightening up, of energetic increases. Do you find evidence for that type of thing in ancient Egypt, and how could that ancient experience guide us today as we move into what some are calling a photon belt or a synchronization beam and this sort of thing?
again, I think one has to be very, very careful about these sort of things. They do sound extraordinarily dramatic. The great problem is that if one tends to focus on some of these ideas, the drama and the melodrama associated with it takes one completely away from the whole basis of what the spiritual progression, the underlying spiritual nature is all about. So I tend to be a little bit cautious.
Right, and it's to say, listen, there's really not an ancient parallel to this, or at least one that you haven't found yet, and so we have to take almost a cautious wait and see kind of approach to these events, because as I'm sure you're aware, it's happening in the UK, it's happening everywhere. There's a tremendous consciousness that's developing around 2012, and this idea of an enormous breakthrough for humanity, or possibly a cataclysmic breakdown of culture and civilization.
Well, yeah, again, I think that's part and parcel of the natural cycle. What I've tried to show in relation to the 26,000-year cycle, at least, is that it has a direct correspondence with the way the annual year of our Earth. In other words, it has its solstices and its equinoxes. And we, at the moment, appear to be approaching one of the solstices.
This is William Henry. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. My guest is John Gordon. We're talking about Earth and its equinoxes. John, could you please continue?
Yeah. The point that I tried to make at some length in the book is that the cycle, the 26,000-year cycle, which is the immediate one we're concerned with, has its parallels with the equinoxes and solstices of the Earth year. Although instead of things taking 3 months for each quarter or season, we're talking in terms of it taking over 6,000 years. So that being the case, in exactly the same way that we can see our Earth reaching sort of critical points at the solstices, when we know that our Earth slows down before it then accelerates away at the other side of the solstice, we find exactly the same idea in the ancient wisdom tradition on a celestial scale in relation to our sun's cycle around its own parent star. Because, as I said a little bit earlier, the 26,000-year cycle appears to be specifically related to the movement of our solar system around its parent star. So if our seasons, the sort of longer seasons, take over 6,000 years, as I suggest in the book, that is perhaps why it is that human civilization grows and then ripens and then falls away in exactly the same way as the fruit on the trees in our normal cycle here on Earth.
You know, one of the terms that I've heard to express this idea of the fruit of the tree of this celestial movement is blue apples. Another term that I've heard to describe that fruit is the blue stones that cause illumination, the divine blue pearl. The Mayans described this time, especially around 2012, when a blessed magical substance they called its would be milled out of the Milky Way. Have you seen any examples of that in ancient Egypt, of the milling of a sacred substance, a blessed substance out of the Milky Way that can transform humanity?
I rather take the view, perhaps I'm a bit old-fashioned about it, the only thing that is going to change humanity is humanity itself. Mm-hmm. It's all very well for the idea of divinity to fall and for humanity suddenly to improve itself spiritually. But that, again, is taking away the whole point of responsibility being on the individual. The more you look at the ancient wisdom tradition, wherever you look in the world, you find the essence of the idea is that man has to stand on his own spiritual feet. He cannot rely upon something sort of manna descending from heaven, and this sort of whisking him off without any further effort on his part. The whole point is that he needs to put his own effort into it if he's going to achieve.
How did then the idea of like a manna from heaven, the dew of the gods, this magical substance the Mayans called it, how did that take hold in the collective imagination then?
Well, there's no reason to suppose that it doesn't actually fall from heaven. But at the same time, whether or not the individual is capable of picking it up and running with it, that's another matter altogether.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take away the fact that you've got to pick up your feet and move onto the path yourself. It's not a magic carpet.
Right, and that's. But yet, isn't there a higher spiritual technology? Do you believe in that kind of concept? And can you give us an example of how that might play in this scenario?
Technology, I'm not so sure about the idea of technology.
Okay, let me say it this way. Try it sacred science. What then?
Oh yes,
there's
definitely. Yes, there's definitely a sacred science. The Egyptians, and you find a similar principle in for example, the Tibetan Bardo system. The essence of the idea, which has been completely misunderstood by Egyptologists, is that there is a sequence within the field of consciousness which the individual can actually learn to follow. But within the field of consciousness, there are signposts, as it were. There are groups of different beings. There are different ways in which things manifest themselves. And therefore it is by an understanding of this sort of thing, as it were the geography of the inner planes of consciousness, that the person learns how to move forward on the path. So there is a science. There is a definite science involved in that, no doubt about it.
And that's, of course, the purpose of the temples in Egypt, then, is to absorb the energies of the various gods represented by the temples and allow the heaven on earth then to unfold within our own selves.
Well, that would certainly be a part of it. The Egyptians seemed to have used the temples as the center of their civilization. So it wasn't just, as it were, for religious purposes. It was there for educational purposes as well. It served the community in all sorts of different ways.
You go to Egypt and you get the sense that you're seeing just a minute portion above the surface of what actually once existed. And then you hear the Gnostic Christians, for example, talking about a labyrinth under Giza and various underground or subterranean tunnel systems, temple systems. Have you found evidence for the actual existence of those underground temples?
Well, there are traditions of the Giza Plateau being crisscrossed by tunnels, certainly. Not only there, but other places as well. And the more one looks at the ancient tradition, whether it be the Mayans or right across the other side of the world, one finds the idea that the initiates of the mystery traditions did a lot of their work underground. Quite why they should have done it underground, other than sort of keeping away from all influences that might interfere with their meditations and so on. It's difficult to say, but certainly one would expect the Egypt as a whole to have very many more tunnels or tunnel systems than have anywhere as yet been found, but exactly the same in other parts of the world as well. I should think that the Yucatan and around there is honeycombed with tunnels. Right,
and so you see this amazing swapping or sharing of symbols from in Central America and Egypt. How do you explain that, the similarity of the symbols and the basic knowledge?
Well, I think it seems to be largely a question of our modern historians having, because they take the view that everything has started really since the end of the last ice age, about 10 or 12,000 years ago. They have no sense of humanity being any older, and therefore they have no sense of culture and civilization being older, despite the many suggestions from the Greeks, the Egyptians, and others that it has been so. Now, the moment you start to ignore what the ancients actually say about history as a whole, again, you tend to lose the plot. And the moment you start to lose the plot, you start to focus on literal ways of looking at things in a modern context, which is completely foreign to the way the ancients actually did things themselves.
And so let's talk more about that plot. And where would you say our present civilization is in the great story, so quote unquote?
That's a big question. That's a very big question indeed. If one looks at a mixture of the Hindu tradition, the Greek tradition, so on and so forth, it would appear as though humanity in the mass, and that means the spirits, as it were, the spirits behind humanity, because we are only the external form, that the cycle involved in the development of humanity as a whole is probably approaching 2/3 of the way through. It hasn't lost its terrestrial nature, but at the same time it hasn't actually really anchored itself to the spiritual nature either. So it's still halfway between and still being torn in both directions. And that is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. That is part of the problem that we face at the moment, of course.
So 2/3 of the way through. I tend to think that that's very good news, but then, of course, you have physicists such as Michio Kaku and others that say, well, this is the moment right here when you either make the leap and you begin to approach more wholeness, or this is when we have the tremendous breakdown. And as you've said a couple of times now, this is a cyclical thing. We come around this cycle from time to time. And so bringing it back to the individual once again, self-responsibility, standing up for yourself, and a general sense of open-mindedness and open-heartedness are two key things. But how else can the individual greatest maximize this moment? How can we best take advantage of this moment in time as spiritual beings?
Well, again, I suppose one could say how long is a piece of string. The first thing to understand is that with every progression, there has to be something left behind. Mm-hmm. The whole basis of spiritual evolution is that it's based upon sacrifice. You cannot move forward without leaving in the past that which is not necessary for the future. The great problem is that it's human beings' natural tendency to try and hang on to both at the same time, and you can't. It's just not possible. So one of the things we have to train ourselves to do is to accept the fact that certain things have to be given up. And one of the ways in which we do that is by doing things for other people instead of ourselves. We get rid of the idea of self. By getting rid of the idea of self, we sort of throw some of the anchorage away. We're able to move further upwards on the spiritual path because we're not tied down with our own sense of our own needs and beings, because a lot of those things are in fact based upon pure imagination anyway.
Right, and living in an amazingly technological culture, it's I think natural to visit the temples of Egypt, which I've done, and you look at the temple walls and you say, wait a minute, that Egyptian glyph right there, that looks exactly the same as the way a modern physicist would portray a wormhole. And do you feel that we're coming into a time now where our intelligence is increasing to a level where we can either A, see anything we want on those temple walls, or B, that we may be coming back to some of the primordial secrets of ancients? And I know there's a lot of writers that are writing on this theme right now of the ancient technology and the idea that we're reclaiming a higher form of quote-unquote spiritual technology. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, well, I have a feeling that modern science actually has actually put its foot over the barrier from physics already into metaphysics, but it doesn't really like to commit itself. If you look at modern string theory, for example, if you divest it of its more materialistic aspects, it is completely metaphysical in its nature. The whole idea of the string is not so much a sort of a wiggling worm in the way that it's described by science, but it is immediately paralleled by the serpents of the ancient wisdom tradition, which curled up and sort of bit its own tail, which is fundamentally a metaphor for the soul itself. So we can see within the way in which science is moving that it is moving in the right direction. But it's a bit like an eternal quick step, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
Right. Yeah, and while it may seem a little bit outlandish to say that the gods of ancient Egypt traveled through stargates or wormholes, I do believe that it's a fact that modern science would be able to benefit greatly by examining some of the metaphysics of the ancient to modern scientific discovery. And especially, as you say, around the idea of string theory. I mean, do you suppose that may be one of the reasons why the serpent is so profusely illustrated in various temple inscriptions and also throughout mystical scripture?
Absolutely. The serpent, the knowledge that is associated with the serpent, not only in biblical terms but elsewhere, sacred knowledge, is always been metaphorically depicted by the serpent. But there is, of course, a lot of reaction against serpents because people don't like snakes. Science does need to understand things in the metaphysics and philosophical terms, and it has to get away from the paranoia that it has, that if it does so, everything will suddenly start to move back towards a dark age. And that's not likely to happen at all.
Do you see any areas of science, though, that are showing signs of moving forward, apart from string theory and the way they're taking that metaphysical step? What about medicine? What are we doing in that area that you see as positive?
Well, it does seem as though we're moving backwards where medicine is concerned. But have a look over the last 20 years, and certainly there has been a tremendous amount of forward movement. You now get doctors, certainly in this country and undoubtedly in the States and elsewhere, interested in chakra systems, all sorts of other systems, psychic and psycho-spiritual systems that would have been completely pushed out of court 20 years ago. So there has been movement. There's an awful lot of sort of fuzziness around it and a lot of cotton wool because people like to sort of provide their own add-ons, which don't necessarily add up to a can of beans, but it's moving, I think, in the right direction, slowly.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, John, is your relationship with the Theosophical Society.
Yeah.
If Madame Blavatsky were around today, how do you think she would feel concerning her body of work and the way that our understanding of the ancient world is such a quest for so many people today?
No, I think she'd sort of oscillate between trying to tear her hair out on the one hand and on the other hand being reasonably happy that it is moving forward. It is moving forward, there's no doubt about it. It just takes time. We tend to think that things should happen instantaneously, but nature doesn't work like that. It works in generations, it works in human lifetimes, because individual human beings not only act as the accelerators, they act as the brakes as well. So it is very much an eternal quick step. We cannot expect things to happen overnight.
Mm-hmm. One of the quests that I went on was an investigation into FDR's search for the Holy Grail in Mongolia. One of his associates in that quest was Henry A. Wallace, his 2-term Secretary of Agriculture, who was a theosophist, a disciple of Madame Blavatsky, to use the term disciple in a very nice way. And we see the way that theosophy, literally, I would say that the 20th century was a theosophical century because of the knowledge that Madame Blavatsky initiated and brought forward, the direction that she pointed people, and the way it influenced not only FDR, but also Adolf Hitler. Where do you see theosophy now going into the 21st century?
Well, I think it's important to realize, as Blavatsky herself said, there was nothing new about anything that she brought forward. All she had done was to, as she put it, culled a nosegay out of flowers from different areas. She merely gave it a coherence that it had not had for thousands of years, probably because it was felt that humanity had the possibility of making a real forward movement. When one looks at the way in which things are moving at the moment, or one looks back over the last 100 years, over 100 years to the time that Blavatsky was around, there has been a tremendous forward movement. You know, there are all sorts of things that have taken place which makes one very optimistic. The ecological movement, the idea that there is one humanity, the idea of the Gaia principle, all of these things are tending towards coherence and making people very much more concerned about the sense that it is one world and one system. Obviously, we need to extend that a little bit further, but it's sensible, I think, to sort of work gradually to be sure of the ground on which we're standing so that we can all move forward together.
One of the other individuals that you give prominent placement to in the book, which listeners, by the way, Egypt, Child of Atlantis, is available at the unknowncountry.com store. Hopefully you'll go over there and pick up a copy. The other person that you mentioned is Schwaller de Lubitz. Talk for a moment about Schwaller's role in our present understanding of the Egyptian mythology and sacred science.
Well, Schwaller de Lubitz was a very interesting individual. Very, how can I put it? He had certainly his own way of doing things, and he irritated a lot of... Sorry?
Yes, he was a maverick, for certain.
He was a maverick, as you say, and he irritated a lot of people, but he did start pointing things in the direction of ancient Egypt being much older, ancient Egyptian civilization being much older than current orthodoxy has it. That, of course, sidelined him as far as mainstream Egyptology was concerned. But then there are quite a number of people today who have read bits and pieces about what Schwaller de Lubitz actually said and have taken that on and sort of moved further ahead as a result. So some of the things he said have been extremely helpful. There have been people throughout history who have come up with ideas that give people the incentive to do some extra work themselves, and Schwaller de Lubitz was undoubtedly one of those.
Yeah, I totally agree. The other aspect of your work I wanted to talk about is this connection that you're making between Atlantis, Egypt, and Tibet. Let's talk about that for a moment, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, as far as Atlantis is concerned, funnily enough, I'm at the moment writing another book on Atlantis because there has been so much response on this issue of Atlantis. I thought that we ought to have a book on Atlantis, pure and simple. So that is being dealt with at the moment, and hopefully it'll be coming out in the next 18 months or so.
You're going to leave us with a cliffhanger on it, then? Or you're going to share with you're going to share with us a tidbit of what's going to be in the next Atlantis book.
Yes, I'll share a tidbit or two, if you like. We have to the essence of what it's all about is anthropological. We have to understand that modern Darwinism does not actually understand the real background of what anthropology is all about, because it makes a lot of assumptions which are based on very unsolid ground. The whole point of what Atlantis is all about is that it goes back to if one goes back beyond Atlantis, one is going back to the origins of humanity as a whole on this planet. And one has to explore that, the spiritual origins of humanity on this planet, before the idea of Atlantis actually starts to make sense as a civilization. So one is talking not only about Atlantis, one is talking about Lemuria, and the way in which these developed their civilizations and cultures as the expression of something there for humanity as a whole, so that we can understand where we stand today. Now, when one looks at Atlantis, the ancient traditions have it, whether you look at it from the point of view of the Indian Puranas and or from other traditions like the Theosophical one, it's quite clear that the original Atlantis went back at least 10 million years.
Wow. And
to some extent, this has been backed up by the work that has been done. There's a book called Forbidden Archaeology by Michael Cremo and I think it's Richard Thompson, which actually shows that an awful lot of human artifacts are to be found going back tens of millions of years well worthwhile book looking at. So it supports the idea that humanity, instead of being basically 100 or 200,000 years old, as modern anthropology suggests, is in fact millions and millions of years old. And therefore, when we start talking about Atlantis, we have to say, which part of Atlantis are we talking about? Are we going back 10 million years, or are we talking about Plato's Atlantis? Because Plato's Atlantis was a mere drop in the ocean, 12,000 years ago. An important one.
That is truly astonishing. 10 million years. And I highly recommend the Cremo book, because you're right. He has just stunning evidence in there of human artifacts, technological artifacts, things that are milled, things that are shaped by machine, that are tooled, that literally, he says, do go back millions upon millions of years. And that is absolutely astonishing to me when you figure that in, that, hey, this is just a mild speck of time that we live within, but yet there still seems to be so much promise in this great house of life that we call Earth, as all members of, as you described, the body of light. I wanted to get your comment on one thing. I live here in Tennessee, and there's a lot of people that drive around with they drive around Tennessee with their fish symbol on the back of their car, rather, and of course this represents. Yes, it identifies them as a Christian, but from the perspective of Egyptian sacred science, what does the fish symbol actually represent, John?
Well, it has an astrological background to it. The fishes swimming in opposite directions. Again, when it comes back to the essence of the idea that we find in the precession of the equinoxes, we think we're going in one direction, and in fact we're going in another. Whether it is the fish actually represents the soul. Mm-hmm. And whereas the terrestrial soul goes in one direction, as it were, clockwise, the spiritual soul goes anti-clockwise in conjunction with everything else in the celestial universe. Our planet revolves anti-clockwise. Our planet actually goes around the Earth, around the Sun anti-clockwise, and so on and so forth. So the moment one starts looking at this, you're looking at completely changing modern astrophysical theory.
Right, and that's what ultimately leads to the advancement in our own higher and further evolution. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yes. It's fundamentally important not to just have a theological approach, but to have an understanding of the way nature works at all levels.
One of the questions that I've had, I truly agree or believe in this idea that the Egyptians had profound knowledge not only of our own Milky Way galaxy, but it appears possibly of other galaxies. How might they have derived that knowledge? They have telescopes? Did they have a spiritual technique for perhaps soul traveling into the stars or other galaxies? What's your comment on that?
Well, certainly Robert Temple wrote a book a short while ago showing that they had binoculars and telescopes in ancient times going back at least. That's right, going back at least 5,000 years. But in addition to that, perhaps one has to take into consideration that the capacity to travel in the soul body, in other words, to have one's consciousness so coherently organized that one could actually travel out of the body in either the astral soul, the terrestrial soul, or the spiritual soul, would enable individuals to pick up knowledge that was totally impossible for us on Earth.
Would you call it remote viewing? I'm sorry, John.
No, not remote viewing. It is something far more profound than that. The individual who is actually capable of dissociating their consciousness from the physical body so as to unify it completely with the soul itself, and therefore to move within that strata of consciousness, and therefore to pick up the knowledge that is to be found within that strata of consciousness. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay. John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Before we go, I wanted to once again invite everybody to come over to the unknowncountry.com bookstore and get a copy of Egypt, Child of Atlantis. It's John's radical reinterpretation of the origins of civilization, and it's packed with over 100 illustrations, many of them, especially those concerning the temple alignments along the Nile, are incredibly helpful for anyone who's visiting Egypt. And I know many listeners of Dreamland will be going to Egypt in the next couple of years and tapping into that. What advice in closing would you offer to those that in their study of Egypt today, or who are contemplating making a pilgrimage or a visit to Egypt? How can they best maximize this study at this time, John?
Well, the important thing is to try and understand that there is a structure within the whole of Egyptian culture and civilization which modern Egyptologists completely fail to see. But you have to look for it. You have to look really very hard. And it's important to try and understand that there are certain keys which you can operate. But I think the fundamentally important, the most important thing for any sort of spiritual development, peculiarly enough, is a sense of humor. If you have a sense of humor, it'll take you all the way.
John, that's a very, very nice way to leave it. And I once again want to thank you very, very deeply for your time today, all your incredible study and hard work here. And I know it's going to have a profound implication as we begin to try and answer these very questions that you've already pursued. And I want to once again thank you very much, sir.
Not at all. My best wishes to all your listeners.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll see you next week.
This is Whitley Strieber. Up next, Linda Moulton Howe. One reporter who loves mysteries is radio's leading science journalist, Linda Moulton Howe. She's an Emmy Award-winning TV producer, documentary filmmaker, and writer, and the reporter and editor for EarthFiles.com, the Internet's most respected edge science website today. She has an absolutely amazing report for us on General Wesley Clark's knowledge of UFOs. Here she is from Philadelphia, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. You know, you've probably wondered, as I have, about what UFO information is given to American presidents. Has every president, since at least Harry S. Truman, had a need to know about aerial discs and their pilots? And if presidents are briefed, or at least some of them, about alleged extraterrestrial biological entities and their technologies, it's logical to assume that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other high-ranking military leaders are briefed about UFOs as well. One likely candidate for a UFO briefing is Wesley Clark, retired four-star general in the U.S. Army. In 1994, General Clark was named Director for Strategic Plans and Policy of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. In 1997, after serving as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Southern Command, General Clark was selected to be Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a position first held by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. As Supreme Allied Commander, General Clark commanded NATO forces during the war in Kosovo. In early 2003, Americans drafted General Wesley Clark to run for president on the Democratic platform. Given General Clark's distinguished military career, it seemed likely to Canadian UFO investigator Grant Cameron that Wesley Clark might have been briefed on unidentified flying objects. Grant is director of PresidentialUFO.com and has made a serious study of American presidential calendars, diaries, and documents dated around the times of significant UFO incidents. Grant Cameron has urged UFO investigators to seek out well-connected people who run for political office and ask them in public press conferences, have you ever been briefed about UFOs? A year ago, in 2003, General Clark surprised people at a political fundraiser by talking about his conviction that human science and technology would be able to take us faster than the speed of light in travel in this universe. People ask, why would a four-star general running for president bring up such an advanced idea, especially in front of a political crowd? And that's when Grant really wanted someone to ask General Clark if he had been briefed on UFOs and their technologies. Finally, last weekend, on October 30th, 2004, Roswell UFO crash researcher David Rudiak did ask General Clark that question and received a remarkable answer.
I was very surprised that Clark made this dramatic statement about going past the speed of light, and he believed it, he argued with it, and all this sort of stuff, four-star general, and nobody asked him a question. He went through the entire campaign until last Saturday night, and nobody asked him, what are you talking about, General? What are you talking about going past the speed of light? Where did you get this from? Everybody was just silent. And because he was on the campaign trail, and because I'm very aware of the fact that the highest-ranking people should answer to UFOs, that they may know stuff, I passed around to a number of UFO researchers in the United States the challenge to get Wesley Clark on the campaign trail and to ask him the question that I always encourage people to ask of the president, and that is not whether you believe in him or what you think about him, but the question, have you ever been briefed? Now, nobody asked him the question until last Saturday. And one of the people that I had asked earlier to ask the question was David Rudiak, who is probably one of the foremost experts on the Roswell crash, emailed me Sunday morning. I got the message, and he stated that he's been on business in Reno, Nevada, and that he had come across Wesley Clark, now out of the campaign, but who is campaigning for Kerry for the Democratic campaign. And in that, he watched the speech. This is David Rudiak, watched the speech, and after he knew what the question was to ask, he went up and asked him the briefing question, and I can give you the exact quote of what happened. General Clark, when you were running for president, you said you thought mankind would one day fly faster than the speed of light and visit the stars. My question is, when you were in the military, were you ever briefed on the subject of UFOs? And just to make a point, what Rudiak said, he said at this point Clark looked down for a moment, shook his head somewhat chagrined with the look like, God damn it, here it comes. Then he looked up at me and he said, I heard a bit. In fact, I'm going to be in Roswell, New Mexico tonight. So Rudiak came back with a question. So, were you briefed? And General Clark said to him, there are things going on, but we will have to work out our own mathematics.
Implying that they have had some exposure to, let's say, a technology, and that something out there, the intelligence behind it, is not helping us. We're going to have to help ourselves?
Yes, and in fact, when it struck me, there's a number of times that high-ranking people have been asked about this, and they've brought up this thing about mathematics. A number of years ago, we had been chasing after Dr. Eric Walker, who was former president of Penn State University, when Vannevar Bush, one of the guy who everybody thought was running the UFO program, when he left the Pentagon, Walker took over his office. Very high-ranking guy, and answered a number of UFO questions indirectly to us. And at one point, he even brought up mathematics. When he was being interviewed, he asked the question, he said, how good is your mathematics? Dr. Walker says, because only a couple of people are able to handle this issue. Unless your mind is like Einstein or likewise, I do not think you will achieve anything. And something I had forgotten to mention was, when I put this out across the United States to a number of different people, I put it to a number of people who were inside NIDS, and some of these people who are connected with NIDS are people who have bumped up against the UFO subject in their former working for the government, and a number of them have been notoriously known as the birds, these various people. One of the people inside NIDS, when I gave them Wesley Clark's initial statement about the fact that we could go faster than the speed of light, had come back and said, a bird told me that Clark has been given access to crash saucer material. And that's why I push very hard for people to actually confront him with the question, have you been briefed? And see what a four-star general will answer. And it didn't happen until Saturday night, and Clark basically confirmed that he knows something about what's going on. And a second incident that popped into my mind when I heard General Clark talk about the mathematics was Jan Hartson, who runs the Orange County UFO MUFON UFO organization, was in a lecture by Ben Rich, and this is 1993, and Ben Rich is talking, and this is the famous story, and I tried to get Jan to be interviewed on this, and he said he's going to write it up for the MUFON Journal, and in there, when Ben Rich started to make comments about the fact that we now have the technology to take ET home, and Ben Rich was the guy who ran Skunk Works for the stealth, fighter and the bomber, and where it's believed that a lot of UFO back engineering of UFO technology has been done. And he basically came out in this lecture and confirmed that they had it. And one of the things that Jan told me when I was in, I guess it was Las Las Vegas last year had said to me that, and Rich was talking about the mathematics, that we've found the thing that we were missing, the part of the equation that we were missing. We've figured it out. And if you know a number of these people who are working on the zero-port energy stuff, help put off people like this, they're always talking about the mathematics, that the mathematics of this whole UFO mystery is very important. That's the key, is the mathematics. So here we have, strangely enough, General Clark bringing up the idea of mathematics being important. We ask him about UFOs, he talks about mathematics. So I found it very revealing.
Mm-hmm.
He actually was very interested in space. He actually wanted to be an astronaut. He's in the Army, but he wanted to be in the Air Force. He couldn't because he was short-sighted. He couldn't get into the Air Force. So he went to West Point and went into the Army. Very interested. He had, in fact, if you go I followed his website all the way through. He actually met, for example, with people like the Mars Society, and they described their encounter with him as we were blown away when they asked him questions like, "What about a trip to Mars?" He said he wanted to speed the trip up. He said, "I think we should be looking at new propulsion and enabling technologies." He said to them, he didn't really want to just go to places we'd already been. They described him, when he talked about space to the Mars Society, as having fire in his voice. He was very interested in space. He's admitted this quite openly. And so in that sense, he's just a guy who is interested and is still, has had to address the question, but still is sort of hiding what he actually knows. But I would say that he has enough that he could break it open, and to me it's an important thing to ask people like presidents, 4-star generals, rather than just people who are in the military. These people carry an awful lot of weight. They're what they say carries an awful lot of weight, and if one of these people should actually start to talk or get confronted by the media, it could break wide open. You could actually get somebody who is on the record, has to tell the truth, and will tell us what's actually going on. And these are the people who should know what's going on.
And after 60-some years, it is still not in the interest of the United States national security interest to open up the extraterrestrial biological entity subject.
Exactly. And then that may be, I always think that's much more complex. If you look behind the scenes as to what's going on, it's not a public interest item at the moment. And in terms of the government, it's always easier to, let's drill another oil well, or you can even look at, for example, the aliens. I mean, the aliens haven't come forward. Why are the aliens covering this up? The aliens are doing the same sort of thing. They're just sort of dropping little hints that they're there, little indications. But if they wanted, I always maintain they could land on the White House lawn and end this thing tomorrow. And they don't. And there may be a very good reason behind the scenes why the aliens and the U.S. government are both gradually, and this is I'm giving a lecture in Las Vegas, and this is my lecture, that the government, the vast majority of things that we believe today in the UFO community are not things we discovered. They're things that have been leaked to us by the U.S. government, whether it's Area 51, MJ-12, crash saucers. This is all stuff that has been gradually leaked to us, and our worldview has been formed by the U.S. government. And the aliens, I think, are doing the same sort of thing. They're just leaking little things, making us more aware all the time, but nobody's actually coming out to end the cover-up. And I think the government and the aliens could both do it, and they haven't, which indicates to me there must be something behind the scenes that we haven't explored carefully enough, and we should look at why are they doing this? What is actually the thing that's stopping them from coming public?
And in my presentation in Las Vegas as well, I'm dealing with what could be behind the policy of denial and misinformation since at least the Truman administration, and that two areas are animal mutilations, human abductions, and another that I'm going to be dealing with is our taking aggression against the DISC technology, and that there may have been retaliation, and that the retaliation may have been surprisingly painful, and that by 2004 and counting, this government does not want to have a discussion with media and public about what it's done in the past to something that may or may not have been able to help us tremendously technologically.
I agree. I think you're going down the right road. I had overlooked it until you just mentioned this thing of cattle mutilations or abductions and this sort of thing. I'll at the other side to see if you were on their side how you would react. If you're the president and you come forward, people say you can release the fact that aliens are here. It doesn't go that way. It's then you face a news conference where you have to answer cattle mutilations, possible human mutilations, retaliation, abductions, all this kind of stuff. And the president, and I don't think they have any way. It's out of their control. They basically can't control it, and no president is going to stand up and say, all this stuff is going on, they're flying around, they're abducting people, they're doing all this kind of stuff, and there's nothing we can do about it. It just is a no-win situation as far as I'm concerned. If, for example, Dr. Eric Walker told us, we kept pushing him and said, you're an old man, come on, you should talk before you die, you have a chance to do this. And he got very angry at one point, and he said, what's the big deal? We haven't blown up the world yet. And I think a lot of the government is that way. We're still, the oil prices, it's not $20 a gallon. Everything is under control. People have jobs. Everything's going along. Don't rock the boat. In fact, I think it was Richard Allen who came out when Richard Nixon was shot. This just was made public a little while ago. The main comment that the National Security Advisor, when Reagan was shot, was the more we make it look normal, the better off we're going to be. So everything was, when a president gets shot, when you see the stock market start to crash, you have to calm people down, make them think nothing has changed, everything's okay, we have it under control, and that's what they're doing on the UFO front. Nothing's out of the ordinary, nobody wants to rock the boat, nobody wants to suddenly admit that all these cows that were mutilated were the aliens, because people are going to, the media will pick it up, play it to its max. People will panic, and then you have a situation that you have to admit you can't control. And nobody wants to be in that position. I wouldn't, and I can see why the president wouldn't. And it's the same example, the story of Danny Sheehan.
Attorney Danny Sheehan is a famous civil rights attorney who has served as chief counsel in many very famous federal trials, including Karen Silkwood versus the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation, the 3 Mile Island litigation in Pennsylvania, the Greensboro civil rights case against the North Carolina Ku Klux Klan. Mr. Sheehan served as First Amendment legal counsel for Dr. John Mack, the psychiatrist at Harvard and the founder and chairman of the Department of Clinical Psychology at Harvard Medical School. And this came about because Dr. Mack was called before the Harvard Faculty Committee to defend his publication of a book called Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens. And after representing Dr. Mack, who died this year, Mr. Sheehan has been featured as a speaker at places such as the International MUFON Conference and the International UFO Congress. And right now, he also serves as general counsel to the Institute for Cooperation in Space, a U.S. citizens group that's dedicated to banning all weapons in space and banning the development of any and all potentially offensive weapons to be used against any potential extraterrestrial civilization. Mr. Sheehan has been exposed in Washington, D.C., apparently, to insider information concerning the presence of non-humans on this planet. And now Grant tells a fascinating story concerning something that Danny Sheehan told him.
There's one congressional staffer, and I won't mention her name. When I was in Washington, she approached me about the fact that there had been a presidential study done for Jimmy Carter, 2 of them, by the Library of Congress and the Congressional Research Service. She worked for Congress. She said, I've never heard this story before. I said, well, it's true. You can believe Danny Sheehan. Danny Sheehan would make this story up. I said, why don't you talk to Danny Sheehan? She said, if this story is true, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. This is the top person in Congress fighting for UFO disclosure. I gave her all the information. I gave her Danny Sheehan's phone number. I gave her the whole thing. 2 weeks later, she's phoning me and saying, I'm busy. My phone is tapped. I can't do it. And I said to her, basically, if you who run Congress can't get somebody inside Congress to talk about UFOs, you can't expect us on the outside to get these people to talk. We have no power whatsoever. Even inside Congress, they're afraid to force people who work for Congress who have to answer the questions. And it just blew me away that this person that I'd heard numerous stories about says this woman would help me. At first came out and said she would help me, and 2 weeks later it was running for the hills. It was just unbelievable, just panicked. Didn't want anything to do with the story.
Which makes you wonder who talked with her and told her to shut up.
That could be. Well, she started talking about how her phone had been tapped, and I knew this story. I'd heard the story before, but it was just bizarre to sit in the lobby at the X conference and hear her, and this went on for hours, and she was just adamant like, I can't believe this has happened, and this happened for somebody who works for Congress that wrote this report for Congress. I want to see the report, and I couldn't believe it. And it was just within 2 weeks, she wanted nothing to do with it. I'm sorry, I can't help you. I asked this woman, she just said she denied it, and I said, well, of course she's going to deny it. I said I want a written question to her that she has to answer, and I gave her the questions, and suddenly it was very strange. And this is, so if you get somebody who's that adamant and who has the power to do something, won't do anything, then, I mean, you and I, we have no power to force people inside Congress to talk, or people who are working for Congress. To me, it's always going to happen under pressure. And we in UFO community, we've exerted, like, except for yourself, myself, Steve Bassett, a couple of people, we've exerted absolutely no pressure on the U.S. government to disclose the story. I don't believe any. It's sort of like when you don't get a single question through thousands of campaign stops by all these campaigns, not one single UFO question, it can't be an important issue. They would just say, who cares? Nobody's asking questions. Let's just put it off till tomorrow. And yeah, go ahead. And
it reminds me that when Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso was alive, and in the 50th anniversary at Roswell in July of 1997, he talked with one of the TV networks, in addition to what he had written in the book, and said that time travel was one of the key technologies of the extraterrestrials. The reporter on that story made the colonel look like that he was senile because he was mentioning time travel. That's how cruel it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the media can play it that way. They can play the UFO story like it's an interesting little thing, like you run it on Halloween Eve, or like just a little bizarre thing, and these people are just a little strange and laugh, and that's the way they handle the story. And
but it would have been in the same category of Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, now deceased, talking about time travel, and General Wesley Clark in 2004, who tried to run for President of the United States, saying that we can exceed the speed of light.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Clark did take a lot of heat on it. If you go back to September of 2003 and look at the articles, he did take a lot of heat for this statement that he made. And I guess then pulled back and said, to stay away from that issue and go back to jobs and the economy and the war and all. You wonder how these people can go to sleep at night knowing what's going on and not say anything, whether it's security clearances or whether it's just public image that they're afraid of. I'm not sure what stops them. Right now, I would say Clark it's just simply the fact that he's campaigning and he still wants to be a respected guy. Maybe he thinks he can run again in 2008 or whatever. That it's all presidential campaigning is all image. You can see how it's very important to have a proper image and to stay away from certain subjects and to answer things a certain way and to stay off subjects that will get you in trouble. But you take a look at all the people and what keeps it. That's why I always said it would be interesting to be inside a presidential briefing like Jimmy Carter's briefing and see what it is that they tell them that actually shuts them up. Because Jimmy Carter, you can see, was very vocal. He was going to release the material, and then he went in there and we know he got a briefing and suddenly shut up and has never talked about it again. Same as we know that President Gerald Ford was briefed, and he was very vocal before he went in. That if you hear the tapes of him talking, he was very vocal that this has got to come out and they should testify and drag these people out and make them tell the truth and stuff. And he became president. He never said another thing about it when he get in. So that's why I always said to people to try to understand that. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years trying to find out what it is that's behind the scenes, what it is that the president hears that actually changes these people's mind. And I always said that maybe if we were in a presidential briefing, we would shut up too if we heard what was actually going on or why they're keeping quiet. There must be a reason behind the scenes, and I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm working very hard to figure out what it is that stops these people from talking. Because threats, in some ways, threats would work in some regard, but it wouldn't work in regards to everything, because a lot of people will just take the documents and run with them and bring the documents out. But if the president is asked, were you briefed on the subject of UFOs? In fact, I had Jimmy Carter, and for whatever reason, they came back on the air and said they wouldn't take the question. And I think Jimmy Carter knew what the question was, and he told the host he wasn't going to take the question. So they know it's a very touchy thing, and it's basically to confirm the fact that inside the government there's something official going on, and that's where we use the word briefing. And Clark knew what it was. And it's the same as when I asked Dick Cheney. I said, in your government jobs, have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? If so, when was it, and what were you told? And that's when he stumbled, and he said, if I had been briefed, and he knew what the word meant, if I had been briefed on that subject, it probably would have been classified, and I wouldn't be talking about it. And basically confirmed to me there's something to it. It's just that no reporters picked up on Cheney saying that the subject of UFOs was probably classified. But it's just a matter of getting somebody at the right time, and then some reporter following up on, is there some truth? What were you told in the briefing? For example, we asked, there was a question asked to Gerald Ford, who confirmed he was briefed. And he was asked, what date was the briefing? And he said, I'm never going to confirm I was briefed. Don't even go there.
And in about 10 days or 12 days or so, at the second annual UFO Crash Retrieval Conference that's going to be held November 12th to 14th in Las Vegas at the Sunset Station Hotel and Casino, Grant and I will be talking. He will be going into much more detail concerning his research into what presidents might have been exposed to, told, briefed, and what their calendars, their diaries, and documents say about their knowledge concerning incidents involving what is called the UFO phenomenon. And I will be focusing on why there has been a policy of denial, that there may be some really good reasons, even though all of us would like them listed and we'd like the truth. And at this upcoming conference, Whitley, I think it's really an important one this year, and I hope all of our Dreamland listeners can seriously consider getting there and calling or going on the computer and going to www.ufoconference.com. Again, that's www.ufoconference.com, and looking for ticket information. And if you get there, November 12th to 14th at the Sunset Station Hotel in Las Vegas, come try to find me. I would love to meet you. There will be a really good lineup of speakers, and the ranges in subject matter will include historic as well as modern insights into what our government knows, other governments know, and what evidence is there that they're covering up hard evidence and hard first-hand testimony.
Oh, well, Linda, it's a tremendously exciting, and, this was, I have to tell you, this was truly a riveting interview. My God. And, pardon me, folks, but I'm just sitting here blown away here.
Well, Grant and I are too, because we think this is really significant.
Well, yeah, my uncle, Edward Strieber, Colonel Strieber, as I've said often, was one of the sources for my book Majestic, as was General Arthur Exon. And they both had different takes on the secrecy. My uncle said, the President of the United States can't sit down in front of a camera and say, ladies and gentlemen, there's somebody here. We don't know where they're from. We don't know how they got here. We don't know who they are. We don't know their motives. All we do know is that they do very odd things, and sometimes to you. Thank you very much. No questions, please.
And that animal mutilations are on that list, and a whole lot of other things that nobody wants to explain. And one of the things to help listeners is that I do have a whole interview, most of this interview, with images and some document excerpts at earthfiles.com right now. It's under science. Anybody can get to this interview. I think it's really important for people to absorb this information. So go to earthfiles.com and read this interview with Grant Cameron about General Wesley Clark.
Yes,
and know that on Saturday and Sunday, Grant will be speaking both Saturday and Sunday in a Part 1, Part 2 called the American presidents and the hard evidence. It's really going to be fascinating. I'm going to be speaking Saturday on what could be behind the policy of denial and cover-up concerning their own document phrase, extraterrestrial biological entities. And there's going to be a wide range of people. Nick Redfern from England, Jim Mars is going to be talking about the Aurora, Texas UFO crash. Don Ledger is going to be focusing on the fascinating Shag Harbor incident that you have been so involved in helping him in that book. Peter Robbins is going to be doing more on the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident. The keynote speech will be from Stephen Bassett, who has been pushing hard politically in Washington, D.C. on trying to get disclosure on all of this. Bob Wood, who has a long, distinguished career as an engineer, who has been probably the spearhead on getting the Majestic 12 documents out into the world and expanding that website. Bob Wood is going to be talking about some of the cases in Leonard Stringfield's crash retrieval reports. Paul Davids, who did the film on Roswell, is going to be talking about more evidence concerning the Roswell crash. And the very last speaker, Ryan Wood, the son of Bob Wood, he has assigned himself to the very tail end, but what a title, The Convenient Deaths in Support of UFO Secrecy.
Wow.
And he's going to be focusing on all the mysterious deaths over the last half century of people in positions to know, such as the astronomer McDonald and possibly Forrestal, our first Secretary of Defense. Those are the two that immediately come to mind. And that it could be part of the ugly underbelly of a subject that modern-day political leaders just don't want opened up.
You know, it's Linda, just before we go, I will say one other thing. Art Exon had the idea that there was a benevolent reason for the secrecy, that was that we weren't far enough along. And the earlier reference to our needing to know understand the mathematics was very interesting to me, because it was quite clear that we were not going to be given anything, that we had to get it for ourselves and understand it for ourselves. In other words, they would not open the door to us. We had to go open the door to them first. And the reason was that if we didn't come out on our own terms, then we would become like one of these disempowered earlier civilizations in our world, like the people of New Guinea and so forth, and essentially were of no further value, because all of our interest would be directed toward getting glass beads, in effect, from the aliens.
Right, exactly. And as an adult looking at children, you realize that there's a metaphor that many things we're not ready to handle in terms of advanced technologies that might be able to vaporize the moon. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. It could be that until we are at such a point that we could come up with the mathematics for time travel, which would imply, it has to imply, Whitley, from everything I understand from quantum physics, they go together. If you can reach the speed of light or exceed it, you then have the tools for time travel.
Exactly.
So, yeah. And,
you do.
And that may be that the non-human intelligence knows that we are confined by our immaturity and our lack of understanding to where we are now with propulsive rockets and that sort of thing, until a point in the future where we would reach a place of evolution, then we might be able to handle. But then you get to the disturbing disclosures that have come to some of us from people in physics and military and government that are implying that our United States government already has experimented with time travel, point to point, and this issue that Wesley Clark, the general, would say he thinks that we will go faster than the speed of light if we can solve the mathematics. The
mathematics is the key. Linda, thank you so much.
Concerned that when I saw it, that it would have exactly the sort of effect that you are talking about. It's a serious book, and unfortunately, who think that the word Atlantis anywhere in the title of a book takes it straight off the wall. That obviously isn't the case, as you will have seen from the amount of references there are in the book to support what I said.
Right, and I can assure you the Dreamland audience, John, takes the title very seriously. Many of us have researched the concept of Atlantis and its connection to ancient Egypt. Having said that, I wanted to share with the audience something that you had written in your chapter called Reflections, which I think really encapsulates this whole notion of where we're at in terms of the Egypt-Atlantis connection. You say that on the one hand, there are Islamic fanatics, who would dearly and misguidedly like to reduce every vestige of Egyptian art and architecture to rubble as the idolatrous products of heretics. On the other hand, what do we have, John?
Well, I mean, the extremists that one finds in any religion are always in a minority, but they are always the most vocal minority, and they try to make out that they are the biggest noise around. The vast proportion of Muslims are in fact very peaceful types, and really, when you get down to talk to them about it, there's not a great deal of difference between what they believe and what the ancient wisdom tradition is actually saying. The thing is, the way in which Islam, and the same in Christianity and Judaism, the way things have been put by scholars and theologians over the last 2,000 years, or 1,400 years in the case of Islam, has distorted the ancient traditions right out of all proportion. But when you actually put it to them in a way that they can understand in their own context, they can see the correlations between them. So there's not a huge difference between what I'm saying and what other people are saying like me.
Aspects of the book that you brought such clarity to, because we've just had an election here in America, and you listen to American talk radio, and we have evangelical Christians claim that the re-election of George W. Bush is a victory for their conservative brand of Christianity, yet we know for a fact that modern Christianity is the Egyptian religion retooled with different names. So how far away are we as a culture when a self-proclaimed majority bases its politics and especially its military policy on a widespread misinterpretation or denial of the facts?
Well, if you look back through history, the same thing has happened again and again. People win wars as a result of it. It's a very ancient idea that the first casualty in war is truth. It's exactly the same where politics is concerned. And where one is trying to get across the ideas and concepts found in the ancient wisdom tradition, there are two immediate problems one comes across. First of all, there is inertia. A lot of people don't actually want to know about these things, because the moment you do start to understand the ancient wisdom tradition, or the tradition itself, you have to start taking responsibility for your own life. It's much easier to belong to a religion and to sort of palm your responsibility off onto somebody else, whether it be a priest or an idea of God or whatever. And politics tends to suffer from the same sort of basic idea. People like to hand over their responsibilities as politicians, the sort of modern idea of priests, just in the same way that scientists seem to take over the idea of priests themselves. So, there's a fundamental hurdle that one has to get over before you can get people to actually start thinking. So it's vitally important to try and get them to understand that the ancient wisdom tradition does not actually conflict with what they're saying. It's just that what they have been told doesn't actually tell the whole of the truth.
Okay, so let's say I'm a person that's willing to,
and thinking people within the normal religions themselves believe.
And what do you think is that invisible bridge? What can take us to a full and more complete understanding of our origins? And can you talk for a moment also about what you feel those origins actually, how did the origins of humanity take place in this context?
It's a very, very big question. The idea of star gods comes from the idea that mankind is divine in its real nature. But without understanding the nature of spirit and soul in the way that the ancients actually understood it, the whole thing falls to the ground. If I try to explain to a scientist today, for example, that the ancient way of expressing the word spirit is directly, in fact, is exactly the same as the way the scientist uses the word energy, except for the fact that the scientist uses the word in a quantitative sense, whereas the ancients used it in a qualitative sense. Provided there is that understanding, then the whole thing starts to come to life. The great problem today is that scientific orthodoxy takes the view that there is such a thing as dead matter, which underpins the whole of materialistic philosophy or science, because science at the moment doesn't have a great deal of philosophy. But the ancients took the view that there was no such thing as dead or inert matter, that the whole universe was a unity of existence with a consciousness and a creative intelligence attached to it. Now, that's quite a long way from the way modern science actually looks at it. And when you start to look at it closely, you can also see how theology, religious theology, has actually twisted away from the central idea so as to make it a very much more personalized thing. And by doing that, they've lost the plot as to the way in which the ancients actually saw things objectively. I don't know if that helps.
And that, to me, is one of the most important.
I think William brings a tremendous amount of talent and ability to this radio program, and I'm very happy and excited to have him with us, and I'm sure you will be too. And I would like to thank all of you for your wonderful prayers and support for my wife, Anne, who, as you know, is recovering in the hospital from a very serious brain hemorrhage. She is, however, recovering well and expected to be fully recovered in about a month. Until that time, however, William will be continuing to do all of the Dreamlands, because obviously I like to read the books very carefully and thoroughly, as does William, and I cannot do that at the present time. So welcome William Henry to Dreamland, and this is a great show, by the way, and later on, do not miss Linda Moulton Howe talking about General Wesley Clark. It is extraordinary. Thank you very much. UFOs, aliens, ghosts, psychic phenomena, lost civilizations, abductions, you name it, we talk about it, because this is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland, where we go farther out on the edge than any other radio program out there. You will hear things here that you have never heard before, and you will never hear anywhere else. So fasten your seatbelts and get ready to fly. I'm going to take you for a ride to Dreamland.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. My guest today is John Gordon. John's a senior fellow of the Theosophical Society of England, where he lectures on ancient history and metaphysics. He is the author of several books, and today we're going to be talking about him with his most recent book, Egypt, Child of Atlantis, in which he reveals that Egyptian civilization is far older than commonly believed, and that its sacred science was the legacy of star beings who founded Atlantis. John, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk to you.
Very, very nice. John, Egypt, Child of Atlantis. Now, you know Egyptologists love that title. Why the title, John?
The title was actually chosen by my publishers, not by me. I was rather
to cross over the hurdle. I'm on the path. I'm open. What's one of the first things you're going to tell me beyond that I must take self-responsibility for my own, I guess my spiritual salvation is what you're saying. What's the first thing you're going to tell me about ancient Egypt and its great monuments? Were they tombs? And how far back does the history of Egypt go, actually?
Well, the history of Egypt, according to a variety of traditions, goes back hundreds of thousands of years to a time when modern anthropology seems to believe that we were still running around in skins and hadn't even thought of the idea of civilized life. Now, once you start looking at Darwinian theory, you start to see a lot of holes in it. Anthropology has followed the Darwinian theory right the way down the line. It has produced an awful lot of assumptions about the way humanity came into existence, and that, together with some of the assumptions made in relation to biblical tradition, has actually conditioned the whole of historical thought, scholars' thought about history, and the suggestion that's come out of it that Egypt is only 5,000 years old. Now, the Egyptians themselves were of the opinion that it went back certainly well over 50,000 years, and there are other traditions that one finds amongst the Greeks and elsewhere that the ancient wisdom was to be found going back amongst the Hindus, the Assyrians, and the Chaldeans well over 200,000 years. So, that being the case, one has to approach the whole subject of anthropology very carefully in order to set the scene before trying to get across the ideas of the ancient wisdom tradition. You know, it's very easy to start halfway up the pole, but I try to approach it from the point of view of looking at the background logic first of all.
And one of the other things that I really liked that you did in Egypt, Child of Atlantis, was to really paint a picture of our sun and solar system as being in a kind of a safe haven